Flint Hills, Kansas, August 1872. The sun was a hammer, beating the prairie into a hard-baked anvil. The heat shimmered over the tall grass, making the horizon dance and writhe. In this shimmering expanse, Vojtěch Macháček was not building up, as a man should. He was digging down. For weeks, his neighbors had watched him. He'd chosen a gentle swell in the land, and with pick and spade, he'd excavated a rectangular pit, 9 feet deep, 30 feet long, and 18 feet wide. Now, down in the cool of that man-made shadow, he was laying the foundation of his cabin. Not on the prairie, but in it. Ormond Fitch, whose homestead lay a half-mile to the east, rode over on his bay mare, reining in at the edge of the pit. Fitch was a practical man, a former quartermaster from Illinois who understood logistics, lumber, and the brutal calculus of a Kansas winter. He looked down at the slow, methodical work. Macháček was setting cottonwood sills on a stone foundation deep in the earth. "Macháček," Fitch called down, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "What in God's name are you doing?" Vojtěch looked up, blinking in the sudden glare. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. "I build my house," he said, his Bohemian accent thick but clear. "You're building a grave," another neighbor, a man named Silas Croft, muttered from beside Fitch. Fitch ignored him, focusing on the technical problem. "You're putting green timber in the dirt. It'll draw damp, it'll rot out before the spring thaw. You're burying good cottonwood, Macháček. That's timber this county needs for barns and fences. It's a foolish waste." Vojtěch Macháček picked up his adze, its blade glinting in the sun. He looked at the log in front of him, then back up at the figures silhouetted against the blinding sky. He offered no defense, no lengthy explanation. He simply said, "The earth will keep it." Then he turned back to his work, the rhythmic thump of the adze echoing from the pit. Fitch shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. The man was mad. He was building his own tomb. What did this quiet Bohemian, this former wine cellar mason, understand about the immense, unwavering power of thermal mass that these experienced, practical homesteaders had so completely missed? Stick with me, and I promise you will learn the fundamental physics that allowed a man to build a pocket of eternal spring in the middle of a frozen hell. We'll explore the science of geothermal stability and see how ancient wisdom can outperform modern brute force. Before we dig in, if you appreciate stories of ingenuity and forgotten history, consider subscribing to this channel and liking the video. It helps us bring more of these incredible tales to light. Vojtěch Macháček was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor was he a frontiersman in the way the men around him were. In his native Bohemia, he had been a sklepnik, a cellar-wright. He had not worked with the soaring timbers of cathedrals or the fine-grained wood of furniture. His hands knew the heft of granite, the damp chill of subterranean air, the precise curvature of a vaulted brick ceiling designed to bear the weight of a vineyard above. His trade was the creation of absence, the absence of heat, the absence of light, the absence of the wild temperature swings of the world above. He built chambers where the slow, sacred work of fermentation could proceed undisturbed, holding a steady, non-negotiable 50 degrees Fahrenheit, whether it was snowing or sweltering outside. He understood the deep, abiding patience of the earth. He had come to America with his wife, Agnieszka, and their 2 small children, Tomasz and Zofie, drawn by the promise of land. The Homestead Act offered 160 acres, a kingdom of grass under a sky so vast it humbled a man. But the sky was not the enemy. The land was not the enemy. The winter was. Their first winter, in 1871, had been a lesson in torment spent in a hastily built, conventional log cabin. It was the best they could do with the scarce timber available along the creeks. The cottonwood logs were thin, the chinking a fragile mix of mud and prairie grass. The cabin was a sieve, and the cold was a physical presence, an intruder that could not be barred. Wojciech remembered the way the cabin itself seemed to suffer. At night, the timbers would groan and crack under the strain of the freeze, the sounds like a great beast in agony. He remembered waking to find the ink in its bottle frozen solid, a black star of ice. He remembered Agnieszka's tears as she showed him Tomasz's leather boots, which had frozen stiff by the door and cracked open like nutshells when the boy tried to put them on. They burned wood constantly, a furious, desperate assault on the cold, but the heat simply vanished into the walls and out through 1,000 unseen cracks. They were living in a thermal basket, trying to carry warmth in something woven from holes. That winter, Wojciech didn't see a housing problem. He saw a physics problem. The settlers were fighting the winter, and it was a fight they could never win. The fundamental failure of the frontier cabin in a place like the Flint Hills was a mismatch of material and environment. The logic of the log cabin was born in the great forests of the East and of Northern Europe, where timber was abundant. There, a man could build walls 2 feet thick from dense, slow-growth hardwood. Those massive wooden walls had a degree of insulating value, and more importantly, a significant amount of thermal mass themselves. But Kansas was a sea of grass. The only trees grew in thin, vulnerable ribbons along the creeks. They were mostly cottonwood and willow, fast-growing, porous, and a poor insulator. A homesteader was lucky to build a wall 8 inches thick. Against a 40-mile-per-hour wind at 10 degrees below zero, an 8-inch cottonwood wall was little more than a symbolic barrier. Heat, measured in British thermal units, or BTUs, is simply energy. It moves from a warmer area to a cooler area, always seeking equilibrium. The greater the temperature difference, the faster the heat moves. Inside a cabin, a stove might create a 70-degree environment. Outside, the wind chill could be minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. That 100-degree differential created an immense thermal pressure, forcing the precious BTUs of heat out through the thin wooden walls. Conduction pulled the heat right through the solid logs. Convection drove cold air through every crack and gap in the chinking, a process called infiltration. Ormond Fitch's cabin was a model of the conventional form. He had spent a premium to haul oak logs from further east. His chinking was meticulous, his stone fireplace a masterpiece of frontier masonry, yet even he was fighting a losing battle. He and his family lived in a small bubble of warmth within a larger shell of cold. They huddled near the fire, wearing coats indoors. The corners of their rooms were perpetually rimed with frost. They were winning the battle in a 10-foot circle around the stove, but losing the war for the house. They had to feed the stove a constant diet of wood just to maintain a stalemate. The problem wasn't their craftsmanship. The problem was their strategy. They were building fortresses to fight the air, but the air was a relentless, invisible ocean, and their ships of wood were leaking warmth at every seam. Vojtěch Macháček's approach was entirely different. He began his work in the late summer, giving the earth time to settle before the first freeze. After digging his great pit, he and Agnieszka spent weeks hauling fieldstone from the creek bed to build a sturdy, 2-foot-thick foundation that rose 4 feet from the pit floor. On this, he began erecting the log structure. He used the same cottonwood his neighbors used, but his purpose for it was different. The wood was not his shield. It was merely a frame, a skeleton to hold up a mountain. He built the 3 walls that were nestled into the earth first, the long back wall and the 2 shorter side walls. He hewed the logs flat on 3 sides, leaving the outer bark only on the side that would face into the room. He notched them tightly, but spent less time on perfect chinking than his neighbors would have. It was the next step that caused the most confusion and ridicule. Using a wheelbarrow and the same spade that dug the pit, he began backfilling. He shoveled the excavated earth back into the gap between the wooden walls and the earthen banks of the pit. He did this slowly, methodically, tamping the soil down every few inches with a heavy post. Ormond Fitch rode by again in September, watching the process with a frown. Two of Macháček's walls were now completely buried, with only the front-facing wall and its openings for a door and two small windows exposed to the world. "You're creating a pressure wall, Macháček," Fitch called out, his voice laced with the certainty of a man who knew he was right. "The first big rain, that soil will get heavy with water. It'll push your walls in, or the frost will heave it. You're building your own collapse." Vojtěch paused, leaning on his shovel. "The earth is strong," he said. "It will hold." Agnieszka, helping him lay sod, looked at the structure with a worried expression. "It looks like a badger's den, Vojtěch," she said quietly in their own tongue. "Badgers are warm in winter," he replied with a rare, small smile. The roof was the final, most radical departure. He laid heavy ridgepoles and rafters, just as in a normal cabin. But instead of splitting shingles or shakes, he covered the rafters with a thick layer of long prairie grass, followed by the inverted sod bricks he had so carefully saved when excavating the pit. He laid them like huge green shingles, grass side down, creating a dense, living mat of earth and roots. By the time he was done, the house had all but vanished. It was a low green hillock on the prairie, with a single wooden face looking east. A thin stone chimney poked out of the top of the mound. It didn't look like a house. It looked like a part of the land itself. The mockery from his neighbors was constant, though rarely to his face. They called it Macháček's gopher hole, or the Bohemian's root cellar. They pitied his wife and children, certain they would sicken from the damp and the dark. The science Vojtěch Macháček was employing was not magic. It was the simple, profound physics of thermal mass. His neighbors saw the earth as a source of cold and damp. He saw it as a massive, predictable, and free source of thermal stability. Imagine two objects in the Kansas sun, a single iron nail and a 1,000-pound boulder. The nail will become scorching hot to the touch within minutes, its small mass unable to absorb the sun's energy without its temperature skyrocketing. The boulder, after hours in the same sun, will be merely warm on its surface. Its immense mass can absorb a huge amount of energy, thousands of BTUs, with only a tiny change in its overall temperature. This resistance to temperature change is thermal mass. The air is like the nail. It has very little mass, so its temperature fluctuates wildly. A sunny day can be 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and that night it can be 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The earth, however, is the boulder. The sheer tonnage of soil and rock surrounding Vojtěch's cabin acted as a colossal thermal battery. While the air temperature might swing 40 degrees in a day, the temperature of the earth 4 feet below the surface, below the frost line, barely changes at all. In the Flint Hills, it holds a near constant temperature of between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit all year round. Now consider the battle for heat. Ormond Fitch's well-built cabin had to maintain a 70-degree Fahrenheit interior against a minus 10-degree Fahrenheit exterior. That was an 80-degree temperature differential. The laws of thermodynamics dictated that his stove had to pump out a tremendous amount of energy just to counteract the rapid heat loss driven by this huge gap. Vojtěch's cabin was a different equation. 3 of his walls were not exposed to the minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit air. They were pressed against 50 degrees Fahrenheit earth. For 3/4 of his home, the temperature differential was not 80 degrees, but a mere 20 degrees, 70 degrees Fahrenheit inside versus 50 degrees Fahrenheit outside. The rate of heat loss is directly related to this differential. By burying his walls, Vojtěch had reduced his home's primary source of heat loss by 75%. The earth wasn't just blocking the wind, it was actively propping up the temperature of his walls. The sod roof, a foot thick and teeming with roots, did the same, insulating far better than any wooden shingle could. He had built a house that was already halfway to being warm before he even struck a match. He had insulated his home, not with wood or wool, but with the planet itself. The first snows came in November, dusting the prairie in white. The green hill of the Macháček homestead disappeared, becoming just another snow-covered drift. The thin plume of smoke from its chimney was the only sign of life. The winter deepened, settling into the familiar, grinding cold of a Kansas January. Then the weather broke in a strange and treacherous way. A Chinook wind blew up from the southwest. For 4 days, the temperature soared into the high 50s. The snow vanished in a rush of meltwater, turning the frozen prairie into a sea of mud. It was a false spring, a dangerous thaw. Inside the conventional cabins, the sudden warmth on the outside of the frozen logs caused condensation. The meticulous chinking on Fitch's cabin, a mix of clay and lime, became saturated. Water dripped from the ceiling beams. A damp, clammy feeling permeated everything. Then, just as suddenly, the Chinook vanished. The temperature plunged, dropping 60 degrees in 12 hours. The wind swung around to the north, a razor blade of Arctic air. Everything that had thawed froze solid. The mud in the fields became iron. The puddles became sheets of glass. For the homesteaders, the consequences were devastating. The water that had soaked into their cabin walls froze solid, turning the chinking to ice and the porous cottonwood logs into conductors of cold. The damp interior of their homes was now a breeding ground for a deep, penetrating chill. The world was coated in a thick, clear glaze of ice. It encased every blade of grass, every branch of the few trees along the creek. Travel became nearly impossible. For 28 days the ice siege held. The sun would rise, glinting off a world that looked like it was made of crystal, but it offered no warmth. The cold was absolute. Families remained trapped in their cabins, which were now colder and damper than ever before. The constant burning of wood did little more than create a pocket of steam in an icebox. Inside the Macháček home, the great thaw and subsequent freeze went almost unnoticed. The massive earthen walls and roof were too thick, their thermal mass too great to respond to a few days of warm air. The temperature inside their home remained steady. There was no condensation, no dripping, no sudden chill. The children, Tomasz and Zofie, played on the packed earth floor in their woolen socks, not their heavy boots. The air was still and dry. The small stove in the corner needed feeding only a few times a day, and its gentle heat was enough to keep the entire space a comfortable 68 degrees. Agnieszka went about her domestic routines as if it were a mild autumn day. She could do her mending without her fingers growing stiff, and the butter in the crock remained soft. For Ormond Fitch, the ice siege was a slow-motion disaster. His cattle, unable to break through the ice to the grass beneath, were beginning to starve. He had hay, but it was in a rick a quarter-mile from his barn, and the ground was too treacherous for a heavy wagon. After a week of watching his herd weaken, he decided he had to risk it. He hitched his 2 stoutest horses to his wagon and began the perilous journey across the slick, frozen pasture. He made it to the hayrick, but the return journey was his undoing. On a slight incline not 500 yards from the Macháček strange hill, the wagon began to slide sideways. A wheel found a hidden rut beneath the ice, and with a crack like a rifle shot, the thick oak axle snapped. The wagon pitched, useless. The horses strained, their iron-shod hooves finding no purchase. Fitch was stranded. The wind was picking up, and the temperature was dropping further. His own cabin was a long, dangerous walk away. The closest shelter was the one he had ridiculed all summer. Swallowing his pride, knowing he had no choice, Ormond Fitch stumbled towards the smoking chimney of the gopher hole. He knocked on the heavy wooden door set into the single exposed wall. The cold had seeped into his bones, and his face was numb. He expected to be met with a gust of damp cellar air. He expected a dark, tomb-like interior. He was prepared to find the family huddled in misery, a testament to their father's foolishness. The door swung open, and Vojtěch Macháček stood there, silhouetted by the warm, yellow light from within. Fitch was hit first, not by a sight, but by a feeling. It was a wave of perfectly still, dry, warm air. It smelled faintly of baking bread and wood smoke. He stepped inside, and the world changed. The wind outside howled, a desperate, frantic sound. Inside there was only a profound quiet. The thick earth muffled all sound. The air didn't move. No draughts tickled his neck. His frozen cheeks began to sting as warmth returned to them. Anishka was at a simple wooden table, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded a large mound of dough. The children were sitting on a rug on the floor, quietly playing with carved wooden toys. They were in their shirt sleeves. Fitch's eyes took in the scene, his mind struggling to reconcile it with the frozen reality he had just left. The room was lit by 2 small windows and a pair of kerosene lamps, and the light reflected off the whitewashed interior walls. It was not dark or gloomy. It was cozy, a sanctuary. Then he saw it. On a small shelf carved directly out of the hard-packed earthen wall, covered by a clean linen cloth, sat another ball of dough. It was plump, taut, and visibly swollen. It was rising. In a world where water froze solid in a bucket by the door, where a man's breath turned to frost on his beard indoors, bread dough could not rise. The yeast would go dormant in the cold. To see dough rising steadily and surely, on a shelf made of the raw earth itself, was not just unlikely. It was an impossibility. It was a violation of the known laws of his winter world. That simple, domestic miracle was more powerful than any argument, more convincing than any blueprint. It was proof. The earth was not cold. The earth was warm. Fitch slowly unbuttoned his coat. He looked from the rising dough to Vojtěch, his face a mask of stunned comprehension. He didn't have the words to capture the scale of his misjudgment. All he could manage to say, his voice raspy with cold and awe, was, "The dough. It's rising." Vojtěch simply nodded. "It is warm," he said. Ormond Fitch stayed for an hour, sipping a hot cup of chicory coffee, while the feeling returned to his hands and feet. He spoke little, but he observed everything. The lack of frost in the corners, the minimal amount of wood next to the small stove, the comfortable ease of the family. He was a practical man, and when confronted with undeniable evidence, he did not cling to his old beliefs. He adapted. When he left, his face was grim with thought. Vojtěch helped him unhitch his horses and get them back to his barn. The broken wagon would have to wait for the thaw. The ice siege finally broke in mid-February. When spring arrived, greening the prairie and turning the mounds of the sod houses a vibrant emerald, Fitch's wife, Mary, paid a visit to the Macháček home. She brought a small sack of flour as a gift and a notebook. "Mr. Fitch is planning our new smokehouse," she said to Anishka. "He sent me to ask if Mr. Macháček would be so kind as to share the measurements of his walls and the thickness of his roof." Word of the warm house spread. It wasn't the story of a strange Bohemian that traveled, but the story of rising bread and children in shirt sleeves in the dead of winter. The local pastor, a Reverend Miller, who was more interested in the survival of his flock than in architectural tradition, visited Vojtěch. He listened intently, not just to the method, but to the philosophy behind it. He was a learned man, and he understood the principle immediately. In the back of the deerskin-bound church registry, Amongst the records of births, deaths, and marriages, Reverend Miller drew a detailed 2-page cross-section of the Macháček house. He annotated it with measurements, notes on the direction of the prevailing winter wind, and a short explanation of how the Earth's warmth was borrowed against the winter's cold. That registry became the county's first architectural textbook. By the time the ground thawed enough to dig the following summer, 3 other families, including Ormond Fitch, were building their own earth-bermed homes. The idea, planted by a Bohemian cellar-wright, was taking root in the Kansas Prairie. The technique Vojtěch Macháček brought from the wine cellars of the Old World was, in essence, a primitive but brilliant form of what we now call earth-sheltered construction. A century later, in the energy crisis of the 1970s, architects and engineers would discover these same principles. They would give them new names: passive geothermal, thermal inertia, subterranean building. But the physics remain the same. A home protected by the immense thermal mass of the Earth requires radically less energy to heat and cool. Vojtěch, with his hands, his spade, and his memory of how to keep wine at a perfect 50 degrees, had built a high-performance home 100 years ahead of its time. There is a profound lesson in that simple, buried house. From the moment they arrived, the other settlers had declared war on the Kansas winter. They built their wooden forts, chinked their walls, and fed their fires like stokers in a desperate battle. They fought the cold every single day, and every day the cold fought back, seeping through their walls, stealing their warmth, cracking their boots. They spent their winters in a state of siege, exhausted by the constant grinding conflict. Vojtěch Macháček never fought the winter at all. He refused the battle. He saw the winter for what it was: a thin, violent skin of cold, stretched over a deep and abiding warmth. He chose not to build a fortress to withstand the attack, but a shelter that the attack would never reach. He didn't defeat the wind. He let it blow harmlessly over his roof. He didn't overpower the frost. He dug beneath its reach. By embracing the earth, he borrowed its deep, steady, ancient patience. The house that hid from winter never had to fight it. If you found this story of quiet genius compelling, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales of forgotten innovators. Let us know in the comments, what other examples of old world knowledge have you seen that provide brilliant solutions to modern problems? We appreciate you being part of our community of curious minds. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices of building sod houses and earth-sheltered structures. Any application of these building methods today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.